So I think we're now going to go straight to some closing remarks. I know that it's been a long day. Now, this is all unscripted, this part of the program. Paul, I have with us Professor Paul Walker and Professor Alan Pert, who's Deputy Dean of the faculty, and I've asked them to contribute some closing remarks. Can I ask a question, Alan?
Yes.
I thought Andrew Saniger's conclusion about environment and prefabrication and sort of what it had led to was an interesting point to conclude today, because if we had to relate prefabrication and what it involves in terms of the construction industry, if prefabrication is something we might think about today, should that prefabrication industry of today also think about environment and embodied energy and issues like that? Because I'm not sure that they were thinking at the time. It was often seen as a stopgap or a need. There's this sort of form of production.
This could take a while. Look, I don't know if anyone in the audience was at Federation Square last night for Peter Botel's talk. Peter Botel was the environmental engineer for Federation Square, which is celebrating 21 years. And I'm sure most people know, but underneath Federation Square is the maze, as he refers to, the first prototype for a natural ventilation system based on anthills, which is rolled out in various projects over the last 21 years. Peter was reflecting on his career, which is 30 years of being an environmental engineer. And he was saying for the first 20 years of his career, he was being asked to deal with operational carbon in buildings. So he spent 20 years of a practice trying to get operational carbon out of a building. So it was all to do with ventilation systems. And he was talking about the fact that you would spec it to the occupant capacity and add about 20% on. They all knew they were over-speccing the system. The shift that's happened since the Paris Agreement is, so you would argue that probably 80% of the problem was perceived to be operational carbon and 20% embodied carbon. The shift since the Paris Agreement of 2016 is to embodied carbon. I think we're at a fundamental point in time in the construction industry and design education, where we're going to see a radical shift in carbon literacy, which will change the way we design. Now, I mean, I don't know if George, you're still here. We've been talking about designing for assembly is a completely different way of teaching. We don't do it. No school of architecture in Australia currently teaches for assembly. You can't suddenly just design a building and then change to an assembly process. You have to design for assembly. The narrative now is not just about designing for assembly, it's designing for assembly and then disassembly. So to do that, I think off-site manufacturing will be, I know we've talked about this for years, about the crisis in off-site manufacturing, the failure. We've seen so many companies establish and then fail for all sorts of reasons, whether it's to do with compliance, whether it's to do with finance. It does need government incentive. I think it was interesting at the last budget that New South Wales government committed $10 million to off-site manufacturing, specifically for the housing sector. So I do think that we are at a turning point. I think carbon literacy, the Green Building Council has set a target of 2030 to get to net zero. And if you consider the construction industry at the moment, globally is contributing 39% of greenhouse gas emissions, then something has fundamentally got to shift. I think it's about 18.5% in Australia, but it's got it. So we have to change behaviours, and that's an integration of design education, architecture. We're fortunate to have a construction programme in-house, but I think it starts in the universities and education as much as it does in the construction industry.
So Paul, thank you. It was a very good answer. Paul, do you want to reflect on some of the issues that you thought were important from today, or things that you thought were missing potentially?
Sure. Well, I congratulate all the speakers today. I thought it was just fantastic, and I presume you're going to try and get a book out of it, and it'll be a great book. And so I mean, these comments are not criticism of what's presented, but I think where we need to go. I mean, with regard to the carbon issue, I thought what Tim said that affordable housing for the Aboriginal community was one part design, one part procurement, and many more parts politics. I think that's true for all these issues that face us. And so I think Alan's projection for what the school can do, of course we have to move, but we're not going to solve the world's problems without politicians coming on board. So I thought in terms of what could be done further in research on, well, not so much prefabrication, but affordable housing generally, is the issue of the way housing in Australia has been financialised. This is a point that Renee touched on. I think this is a point that the faculty has a property program, and yet it's completely divorced from the architecture program. And I think we need to do some work to find ways of understanding the implications of the financialisation of housing since the Second World War. And right now we're dealing with the terrible consequences of this. I mean, Miles pointed this out right at the beginning of his talk today. The other issue I thought was a bit missing today, apart from, the urban thing, which I already commented on,
yes,
was I think the 1950s, when most of the projects we were talking about today, I think represented a watershed in women's experience and women's rights. I don't think we can understand housing in the 1950s and the post-war period just from the point of view of kitchens. I mean, Ruth Fincher, former dean of this faculty, has pointed out in her work that the general ownership of cars in the 1950s liberated women to live in the city in a very different way. And I think that's a very important part of, kind of how housing operated in the urban realm and how people actually operated in it. So I think that's, and again, people are doing work on this, but I felt like it would be, if you're going to expand your book, I would invite a scholar who really knows this world, because I think it's absolutely important. My own mother, was a nurse in the New Zealand Army in the Second World War, and she never resigned herself to suburban life. She found it incredibly difficult. And so, it's a sort of issue that I've always lived with in my own family. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, right. So that's what I think.
Right. Thanks, Paul. Alan, I want to ask about many of the houses that we saw prefabricated came as bundles or kits. And I wanted to ask you about the idea of kit homes. Mm-hmm. They have a bit of a history during the 1960s. Do you think there's still a potential for the idea of the sort of kit home?
Yeah, absolutely. We've obviously written about it recently, which will be getting published next year in relation to merchant builders. A really fascinating history behind their kit manufacturing, which started with the Terry Dora's competition win in 1971. The steel, he designed 3 kit houses, if you like. One was a steel house, one was a composite panel, one was a timber house. 3 of them built in Mount Eliza, still there. The timber one was the only one that was developed further. And they turned it into a two-storey house. They developed it into a whole kit business, which expanded up into Queensland. And I think they ended up with about 8 types based on that original kit from the 1971 gas and fuel competition. So yeah, there's a fascinating history there to talk about. But look, just more generally, I just want to come back to this thing about carbon again, because it's consuming a lot of conversations at the moment. If you look at the construction industry in Australia, I think it's something like 3.6% currently deals with prefabrication, typically not housing. Schools and the school pipeline, so there's about 30 new schools that have been built using prefabrication. Prefab Oz were a product of that shift. It required the government, going back to the government, it required the government, so the School Building Authority, to give security to the pipeline for construction practices to shift. So there was a pipeline of activity. We've got currently a 200,000 homes a year shortage in Australia. So we've got a pipeline, but it needs a government to direct and fund and support that initiative. So we've got clarity and certainty for the construction industry, particularly in housing. But currently it's fragmented in terms of decision making and funding. So I think that's a huge opportunity to shift the culture and the behaviour in the construction industry. Sweden, 85% in housing is prefabrication. Germany, 26% and growing rapidly. The interesting thing to look at, going back to this notion of kits in the German context, is that yes, they have kit manufacturing. They're moving much more away from the dominant, what's been dominating the last 20, 30 years is panel systems, structural systems, fully insulated. They're moving into much more of a lightweight approach. So they would describe it over there like the wing of an airplane, trying to get it as thin as possible and as lightweight as possible. And I think that's the big shift that's coming in construction practices, is issues of weight, because again, it's a carbon issue. So the thinner, the lighter you can make it. So we're starting to see kind of hybrid solutions and composites again coming in, but lightweight timber is the big shift that we're seeing, particularly in some of the European countries.
Look, it's interesting because many of the examples that we saw today were lightweight timber.
We're returning to the 19th century, aren't we? No, but I think there's a serious point in this. I think we've been over-engineering buildings for 150 years.
Yeah.
I mean, Peter Botel admitted that last night. We're over-speccing. Currently, the air pump is over-specced, which is causing a big problem in Europe at the moment in terms of retrofit.
Don't you think, Alan, a big problem with carbon is the continual demolition of buildings to be replaced by, the street where I live, out in the suburban Melbourne, probably I would guess that in the last 3 years, probably 20 houses of the 100 houses on the street have been replaced with big giant houses which have very poor thermal performance. And I don't, and you could improve the construction quality as much as you like, but the sheer fact of the amount of demolition that's occurred and all of that product is just being dumped. None of it's retrieved in any way. I mean, I think if you looked at suburban Melbourne, you would say that the best way to deal with carbon was to stop demolishing things.
Do you want to talk about the campus master plan? No? Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I think that culture is shifting. I mean, again, there's some policy in the European context that's saying no new build. We start with retrofit. Again, I think that's a very nuanced conversation. Currently in the UK, to retrofit a house is £60,000. It needs to get to £22,000 to make it actually work. So there's a supply and demand issue that goes on in all of this. So yeah, but look, I think retrofit is another huge responsibility for us as an education institution to get on top of.
Well, I'm going to close things now. We've had a very long day. Thank you, Alan and Paul, very much. So let's thank Alan, Pert and Paul Walker. I'd like also to thank all of our speakers today, particularly to Maria, who got up extremely early in the Netherlands, to Andrew Saniger, who was extremely well organised to produce a video for us, and to all of our speakers from the MSD. Thank you so much. I'd like to also thank Theo Blankley, who's been hovering and seeing in the background. So Theo, thanks so much. And also to Basil there. I promised I would thank him. And invite you to join us for a drink. Thank you very much.